They called her just a maintenance technician and laughed when she asked to fly the F-16. The young pilots at Nellis Air Force Base thought she was crazy until the engine failure alarm started screaming at 25,000 feet, and suddenly everyone realized the technician was the only one who could bring them home. The Nevada desert sun blazed down on Nellis Air Force Base as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos walked across the tarmac carrying her toolkit. The young F-16 pilots lounging near the aircraft barely glanced at her, just another maintenance tech doing routine checks. At 34 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she looked like every other ground crew member they'd seen 1,000 times before. "Hey, wrench turner," called out Lieutenant Jake Morrison, fresh from pilot training with exactly 200 flight hours under his belt. "Make sure you tighten everything properly this time." The group of pilots chuckled, their flight suits pristine and patches still bright from recent graduation ceremonies. Maria said nothing, just continued her systematic inspection of the F-16C Fighting Falcon's engine bay. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking hydraulic lines and electrical connections with the kind of attention to detail that comes from years of experience. She'd been maintaining these aircraft for over a decade, but to the pilots, she was invisible, just part of the background machinery that kept their jets flying. What they didn't know was that Maria had more flight hours in F-16s than most of them combined. Before her transfer to maintenance, she'd been a test pilot for experimental avionics systems, flying missions that pushed the Fighting Falcon to its absolute limits. Her records were classified, her achievements buried in files marked with security clearances the young pilots would never see. The morning briefing called for routine formation training, 4 F-16s practicing air-to-air combat maneuvers over the restricted airspace west of the base. Lieutenant Morrison would be flight leader, with 3 other recently graduated pilots following his lead. Standard procedure, nothing that should challenge experienced aviators. But as Maria completed her pre-flight inspection, she noticed something that made her pause. A subtle vibration in the number 2 hydraulic pump, barely detectable, but definitely present. She made a note on her checklist and flagged the aircraft for additional monitoring during flight. "Something wrong with my bird?" Morrison asked, seeing her concentrated expression. "Just a minor hydraulic fluctuation," Maria replied, "within acceptable parameters, but worth watching during flight." Morrison shrugged. "These things always have little quirks. That's what mechanics are for, right?" He dismissed her concern with the casual confidence of someone who'd never experienced real equipment failure in combat conditions. 20 minutes later, the 4 F-16s rolled down Nellis's main runway and lifted into the clear desert sky. The formation climbed steadily toward their training altitude of 25,000 feet, where they would begin practicing intercept scenarios against simulated enemy aircraft. But at exactly 23,800 feet, Morrison's hydraulic warning light illuminated red. "Nellis Tower, Viper lead experiencing hydraulic system warning," he radioed, his voice still calm but with an edge of concern. Within seconds, the warning escalated to a full system failure alarm as his primary flight controls became sluggish and unresponsive. The F-16 Fighting Falcon is a fly-by-wire aircraft, meaning computer systems translate pilot inputs into control surface movements. When hydraulic pressure drops below critical levels, those controls become extremely difficult to manage. Morrison was suddenly flying a 16,000-pound aircraft that was fighting him for control. "Viper lead, declare your intentions," came the urgent voice from Nellis Approach Control. Morrison's breathing accelerated as he struggled to maintain level flight. His training had covered hydraulic emergencies, but the reality of wrestling with an unresponsive fighter jet at altitude was overwhelming his preparation. The aircraft wanted to roll left and nose down, and he was rapidly losing the physical strength needed to counteract it. I'm not sure I can maintain control," he admitted, sweat beading despite the cockpit's environmental control. That's when a calm voice cut through the radio chatter. "Nellis Tower, this is Santos. I'm qualified on emergency recovery procedures for hydraulic failure in F-16C aircraft. Request permission to talk Viper lead through the situation." The tower controller paused, confused. "Santos, say again your position." "I'm in the maintenance bay, but I have extensive experience with this exact emergency scenario." Lieutenant Morrison, fighting to keep his aircraft stable, didn't care who was offering help. "Anyone who knows what they're talking about, please advise." Maria's voice came through clear and steady. "Viper lid, first priority is reducing your airspeed to minimize control forces. Throttle back to 85% power and begin a gentle descent to 15,000 feet. The thinner air up there is working against you." Morrison followed her instructions, immediately feeling some reduction in the control stick forces. "Okay, that's helping slightly." "Good. Now, listen carefully. Your backup hydraulic system should still be functional, but you need to manually engage the emergency flight control mode. There's a switch panel to your lower left, marked EMRG-FLT. Flip the backup hydraulic switch to on position. As Morrison followed her guidance, other pilots in the formation watched in amazement. The voice guiding their flight leader through this crisis belonged to someone they'd dismissed as just a mechanic hours earlier. "Emergency hydraulics are online," Morrison reported, relief evident in his voice as his controls became more responsive. "Perfect. Now you're going to need to plan your approach carefully. With reduced hydraulic pressure, your landing will require about 30% more runway distance than normal. Request a straight-in approach to runway 21 left. It's the longest available." The tower immediately began clearing air traffic and preparing emergency vehicles, but Maria wasn't finished. Viper led. "During your approach, maintain your airspeed at exactly 185 knots until final. Do not let it drop below 180 or you'll lose elevator authority. Your touchdown will be firm. Don't try to grease it. Accept a harder landing and focus on staying centered on the runway." For the next 20 minutes, Maria guided Morrison through the most challenging approach of his brief career. Her instructions were precise, anticipating every complication before it occurred. She knew exactly how the F-16 would behave with partial hydraulic failure, because she'd experienced similar emergencies during test flights. The landing was textbook perfect, firm but controlled, with Morrison maintaining directional control throughout the rollout. As the F-16 came to a stop, emergency vehicles surrounded it, but the crisis was over. After shutdown, Morrison climbed down from the cockpit on shaking leg. He found Maria waiting near the aircraft, having driven out from the maintenance bay to inspect the failed hydraulic system. "How did you know exactly what to do?" he asked, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Maria looked up from the hydraulic bay she was examining. "Because I've flown this aircraft through that exact emergency before. Multiple times, actually." Morrison stared at her. "You're a pilot." "Was a pilot. Test pilot, specifically. I spent 8 years putting F-16s through situations that would make your training scenarios look like video games." She pulled out a pump component that had clearly failed, including deliberate hydraulic failures to test emergency procedures. Word of the incident spread quickly through Nellis. By evening, every pilot on the base knew that the maintenance technician they'd been dismissing had more F-16 experience than most of their instructors. The next morning, Morrison approached Maria with a different attitude entirely. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology, and probably my life." Maria continued her inspection routine, but her tone was warmer. "You don't owe me anything. I chose maintenance because I wanted to keep these aircraft safe. Sometimes that means turning wrenches. Sometimes it means talking pilots through emergencies. But why didn't you tell us you were a test pilot? Because that part of my career is over. Now I make sure these jets are mission ready for pilots like you." She paused in her work. "Though I'd suggest you listen more carefully to your ground crews in the future. We see things you might miss." Within a week, Maria had been invited to guest lecture at the pilot training program. Her session on emergency procedures became legendary among F-16 pilots at Nellis. She taught from experience, not textbooks, sharing insights that could only come from someone who'd pushed these aircraft beyond their design limits. But she always returned to her maintenance duties, preferring hands-on work to classroom instruction. The young pilots now greeted her with respect, understanding that the quiet technician checking their aircraft might be the person who saves their life someday. Years later, when pilots told stories about the best emergency guidance they'd ever received, many would mention the calm voice that talked them through impossible situations. They learned that experience doesn't always wear pilot wing, and sometimes the most valuable knowledge belongs to people who choose to work in shadows rather than spotlight. Maria never sought recognition for her test pilot background. She was content knowing that every F-16 that left Nellis was as safe as her expertise could make it, and that young pilots now understood the difference between rank and knowledge. The F-16 Fighting Falcon continued to serve as the backbone of American air power, flown by pilots who learned to respect not just the aircraft, but the people who understood it best. And sometimes, in critical moments, that understanding came from voices they'd never expected to hear.